Hi, I'm Charles LaBeouf. This morning you'll be joining me for a beach walk at the historical Sanibel Lighthouse Point on Sanibel Island on Florida's southwest Gulf Coast. I hope you... Okay, I understand that some of you folks have been on Sanibel before. This is not your first visit, is that correct?
Yes, right.
How many years have you all been coming here?
5.
5? Anyone more than 5 years?
No.
Good, that's a good cutoff period, because some of the things that I'll tell you this afternoon will have some bearing on what's happened to Sanibel Captiva over the years. I'm Charles LaBeouf. I first came here as a visitor, as most folks do, in December of 1952. And little did I know that some 6 years later I'd have the opportunity to move here as a permanent resident. I came here in the latter part of 1958 to work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on the Ding-Darling National Wildlife Refuge. My background is in wildlife management, wildlife biology. About 8 years ago I started doing the beach walks because it gave me an opportunity to share with folks some of the things that I'm very interested in, and some things that I think are very particular and specific to Sanibel Captiva. The beach walk will last approximately an hour and a half. It'll be very informal. When I'm through with my discussion, if you have any questions that you want more detail on or something that I can get a little bit more elaboration, then please feel free to shoot any questions at me. Okay, first of all, just a brief overview of the islands. I'll be drawing some maps on the ground this afternoon. About 10,000 years ago, because of certain changes in the ocean's water levels, Captiva was created as a large barrier island, a barrier island being a landmass that protects the mainland from the brunt of serious storms, like hurricanes and tropical depressions. Captiva is approximately 10,000 years old. About 5,000 years ago, because of certain current factors that I'll be getting into a little bit later on, a southeastward leg began to develop off of Captiva, and Sanibel was created as a large crescent-shaped island that is atypical because its configuration is east and west, not north and south. Incidentally, south is sort of off in that direction, then of course north, east, and west. We're standing on the eastern projection of Sanibel, the Lighthouse Point, or Point Bell. If we were to fly above the island several thousand feet and look down at it, we'd see that Sanibel is nothing but a series of ridges and swales. There is a ridge where a storm some many years ago put up a pile of shell, and then a subsequent storm came along with not quite the same wave energy as the first one, where it didn't quite join together. So there's a depression, or a swale, between the two ridge systems. The land we're standing on now is loosely called the Gulf Beach Ridge. It's the ridge closest to the Gulf of Mexico. In the middle of the island is the Mid-Island Ridge. That's where the Sanibel Captiva Road sort of cuts the island in half. North of that is the mangrove forest of the Ding-Darling Refuge. What we'll be doing first off is walking into one of these swale systems and talking about some of the basic ecology of those systems, some of the more interesting aspects about the formation of early Sanibel. But before we leave the parking lot, these trees that are so common, I'm sure many of you have seen them over the years growing very thickly here and there along Periwinkle Way. They were brought here back in the early part of the century primarily as ornamental plants for sort of dressing up the main drag, Periwinkle Way. They were also brought here by farmers. They were used for windrowing the crops back in the early part of the century. They were put here about 1915. And those trees that are growing on Periwinkle are the original trees that were brought here by the early farmers. They're now about 70 years old. The casuarina has the unfortunate habit of dropping these tiny cones that you'll see littering the ground. You can roll them under your feet. When we get a serious storm, and we'll get a wave overwashed, when the waves recede, they carry these little cones with the change in water levels. And these will germinate right out to the high tide line. If you've been to Bowman's Beach, I understand you have a home on Gulf Ridge.
Yeah, we're right next to Bowman's Beach.
Right, these things are constantly encroaching on the beach face. And as they do, they drop these specialized leaves. They really aren't needles. If you look at them closely, they're segmented where they join together. And as they do this, they produce a reaction that basically acts as a soil sterilant, because the more desirable native beach plants that stabilize beach faces are prevented from growing through it. So locally, the casuarina is classified as an exotic plant that is a noxious or an undesirable plant that is being killed wherever it occurs on public or private lands. On the Ding Darling Refuge, most of the trees, as you go up Sanibel Captiva Road, you'll see great stands of dying casuarina. On the left-hand side, on the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation property, you'll see the casuarina there are dying too, where they've been injected with a specific poison to kill them. Gulf Beach Ridge System, a few other plants that are rather typical of this type of a situation and are very common here. The tree that has the large round leaf on it is the sea grape tree. That produces a cluster of grape-like fruit in the late summertime, and it's rendered into a very good jelly called sea grape jelly. You can buy that at the visitor center of the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation. Then to the left of it is a tree that has a sort of a reddish tint to it. It has peeling bark. There are some vines hanging down from the upper parts of it. That's the gumbo limbo tree. The gumbo limbo grows in the higher elevations, the ridge systems, and also on some Indian mounds that are found on the islands. And like a great many tourists that come to the islands, we should all classify ourselves that way, I think, because the locals call this the tourist tree, because it's continually peeling. Everybody see the sunburn tree? So I'll caution you at this point, of course, wear a good sunscreen. Don't rely on suntan lotions to do the trick to preserve your skin. And then to the left of it is a tree that has large vines hanging down from it. That's a strangler fig. The strangler fig produces a small fig-like fruit. On some varieties, it's about 1 inch in diameter. It's edible. You can pick them and eat them the same as you would a commercially grown fig. The palm trees are the cabbage palms. They're Florida state tree. And I'll develop a little scenario for you. Let's say that an animal that likes to eat the strangler fig fruit, specifically a raccoon, climbs up a strangler fig and ingests great quantities of the little fig fruit, and then he climbs down and he'll climb up one of these cabbage palms and get up close to where the fronds connect to the trunk of the tree. In the basal part, this is where the frond connects to the trunk. And quite often there's a little bit of organic material there and some moisture. The raccoon dozes off and he's digesting the outer part of the fruit of the strangler fig, but the tiny seeds pass through his GI tract. And a specific seed may be deposited in the stool in the basal part of the frond. And if it's lucky, it will germinate, turn into a tiny strangler fig tree, and over a period of years begin to send down long, lacy prop roots that will eventually connect to the ground. And quite often a gust of wind will come along and drive the root around the rough bark of one of these trees where it sticks, and the roots continue to grow. And the end result is what you see there. You'll see on the right of the strangler fig is the dead stump of a cabbage palm with one of those prop roots going directly down through the center. So the strangler fig has literally choked the host tree. Now, I'm not saying that all strangler figs are out to kill cabbage palms. It doesn't work that way. It only takes that specific situation that occurs probably 1 in every 1,000,000 times for that tree to end up as you see as has happened there. The cabbage palm is Florida state tree. It's also more properly called the sable palmetto. They are used in Florida, or they were used historically as a food plant. You cut the tree down and you begin to peel away the bud. You'll notice how the fronds are growing straight up at the center. You peel that away, you end up with a product about 3 inches in diameter, maybe 18 inches long. You keep peeling it until it's fleshy. It's all a uniform, basically a uniform consistency. You slice it up about 1/4 of an inch thick. You toss it in a frying pan with some salt pork or some bacon, fry it up. You have a product called swamp cabbage. It's very good. It's still sold in some of the local stores that sell produce. You can also buy it as hearts of palm for your salad. Most of that, however, is imported. It's not the native cabbage palm. Of how the strangler fig gets around the host tree. The aerial roots have connected to the ground. It's firmly and completely around the host. The strangler fig is a ficus. It's very closely related to the banyan trees that you buy as houseplants. And if I make a little nick here with my knife as you walk by, you should see a flow of white latex developing. And if you had enough of these growing, I assume you could make first quality rubber, because the commercial rubber tree is also a ficus. Over that Gulf Beach Ridge, we're now standing down in one of these depressions, one of these swales. What probably happened here historically, a storm came along and heaped up a pile of shell on the Gulf side of Sanibel. Then some years later, another storm with not quite the same intensity as the first came up and heaped up another pile. And this was a tidal system where the tide would ebb and flow. The first plants to colonize an area like this are typically the mangroves. The first of those is the red mangrove. We'll see some of those a little bit later on. The second in the transition between the marine and the upland is the white mangrove. And the third is the black mangrove. There's a fourth tree here that some local naturalists will tell you it's a mangrove, but it's really not, and I'll tell you why it's not a little bit later. And that's the buttonwood tree. And these large, grotesque trees that are growing through here are buttonwoods. And we're now standing in what is called a buttonwood strand. If you'll notice the dark dirt on both sides of the road, this shell was put in here to raise the trail some years ago. The dirt is because of the breakdown of organic detritus, foliage, and other woody materials falling from the trees, building up over the years. And the black soil is responsible for Sanibel being heavily farmed back in the early 20s. Sanibel was heavily cultivated for produce like tomatoes, peppers, squash, and Captiva was cultivated in grapefruit and key limes. It was a thriving little industry. The farmers were very successful. And then in 1926 along came a hurricane. They weren't named in those days. And the hurricane put up a 12.5-foot tide, storm surge. The highest point on Sanibel is only 12 feet. So Sanibel, Captiva were completely inundated. The farming was destroyed, of course. The soil was salted, and I'm told it takes something like 7 years for the soil to regain its growing ability. So farming died, the people moved away, and the island became just a tiny little community with fishing as the primary source of income for the people. And then after World War II, people began to discover the island. It was sort of quiet and quaint. Authors came here to write novels and things like that. And then by 1963, the causeway was constructed, which opened a gateway to the island. Prior to that, we had 4 ferries. Each ferry carried 8 or 9 cars, and that was the only way you could get here, other than fly into an airstrip that was located over at Casabel, what is now Casabel Resort. The Island Water Association began to distribute water through the islands, and by 1965 most areas were served by a good source of potable water. Back in those days we were under the government based over in Lee County, the Lee County Commission, and the county government was allowing things to go on here that the people on Sanibel basically weren't happy with, things like building densities at 44 units per acre, the county was allowing construction to go out on the beach face within about 25 feet of high tide, and there was no real control on what was happening here. So by 1974, the people on Sanibel had it up to here, so we decided we'd incorporate. We'd pull away from the county government. We became the city of Sanibel. Captiva is not part of the city. It decided it would stay with Lee County and hope things worked out okay for them. It really hasn't. Some folks up there think it has, but it hasn't. And one of the first things we did on Sanibel was to adopt a comprehensive land use plan that established certain regulations. We reduced the building densities from 44 units per acre down to 5 units per acre. We adopted the coastal construction setback line that was established by the state of Florida, that is a theoretical line based on computer readouts on what storms can do under different intensities, different configurations and wind directions. And I'll point that line out to you a little bit later on. So the development of Sanibel has been considerably slowed, or at least reduced in density over what it could have been. And although you see a nice, thriving building industry, there's a lot of nice homes going in and a lot of multifamily buildings, they're being built at that reduced density, 5 units per acre. Some areas are down to 3 units per acre, and not the potential that we would have experienced had we not pulled away from Lee County. I got off on a little tangent then. Getting back to some of the other aspects of this area, I noticed when we first grouped together you were talking about mosquitoes and sandflies and repellents and that sort of thing. Within a few yards of us are the dormant eggs of salt marsh mosquitoes. The salt marsh mosquito is the little biting mosquito that you experience here. It's a nuisance mosquito. And there are millions of mosquito eggs on this damp sand. And the salt marsh mosquito starts its life cycle out, unlike most mosquitoes where the adult will get a blood meal and deposit the eggs on the surface of the water. The salt marsh mosquito will lay its eggs on these muddy or semi-dry areas. And the eggs can remain dormant for, well, up to 20 years. When we get a flooding rain, and our rainfall begins here usually about the middle of June, average rainfall is about 54 inches per year, about so much rain. By August, the water in here is knee-deep. We can't use this trail. So the rising water hatches off the mosquito eggs, and mosquitoes come off by the trillions. In fact, at the old ferry landing, that's about a half-mile west of us on the bayside, back in 1950, the State Board of Health put up a light trap device, and in one dark period, from dusk until dawn, that trap trapped 366,000 salt marsh mosquitoes. And that's a record that has never been broken, never been touched anywhere else in the world. Technicians counted them. It's not that hard. They use grid work systems, and it's a fairly accurate means of counting. So to combat that problem, the problem was recognized that Sanibel was producing most of the mosquitoes for the county. They developed a mosquito control program, and they came over here to Sanibel. In the middle of Sanibel is like a large basin. And what would happen when the annual rains come, that basin would fill up with water. And by the 1st of October, it would break through the Gulf Beach Ridge down at the Colony. That's about a half-mile west on the Gulf side. And all of the water in the middle part of Sanibel would flow out through that break in the beach, and all of that water would drain out. Then, of course, the exposed soil provided habitat for mosquito eggs, and the mosquitoes would lay their eggs again, and the cycle would start over again. So this mosquito control program channelized this Sanibel slough. They dug a main canal down through the middle of the island. Then little tributary canals came off of that, and those tributaries broke through these ridges and connected all of the swales together. So now all of the low areas of Sanibel were connected by this maze of canals. So what happens now, when we get our rainfall and the water rises, in the permanent water provided by the main mosquito ditch that is today called the Sanibel River, there's a little fish called a gambusia. It's about an inch long, and it eats mosquito larvae. And as the water rises, these fish are carried with the water. As the eggs hatch, the fish are there to eat the mosquito larvae, and it's a very sound and proven technique of biological mosquito control. And it does work. You'll feel a few mosquitoes, and of course the cutter does work for mosquitoes, and I heard people talking about You know the secret about Avon Skin So Soft as being an effective weapon against the sandflies or the no-see-ums. That's the only thing that will work for sandflies. You can take a bath and off or cut or whatever that is, or even drink it. It won't work against the sandflies. The nice, sweet smell of the Skin So Soft does the job.
That's funny.
Okay, another few plants before I forget them. These large ferns are the leather fern. They're the largest fern in the 48 contiguous states. And then up high in the trees, you'll see some plants that look like the tops of pineapples. They're the pineapple air plant. They're a bromeliad. They're not a parasitic plant. They attach themselves very firmly to the tree, but all of the nutrients come directly out of the atmosphere. And then we have one native orchid, epiphytic orchid on Sanibel, and that's these little fellows here on this limb that have the tiny bulbs and the white roots. That's the butterfly orchid. They bloom in May and June with a beautiful white and lavender blossom.
Yeah.
You getting it okay, Phillips? Look closely. The water's fairly clear right now. In the sunlight, you can see those little gambusia. Those are mostly gambusia, and there are also some mollies in there that are very similar to the pet store mollies used for aquarium purposes.
Like minnows, are they?
Right, those little minnows. Those are the ones that do the job in controlling mosquitoes. Without them being here to do the job, when you see what will happen, this water will rise with rainfall. That tributary to the right will flood that buttonwood strand, and these fish will then swim up and eat those mosquito larvae as they hatch. It's a very successful program. Other times of year, they're feeding on other things that are in the water, other types of small insects and small near-planktonic animals. I mentioned the red mangroves. The red mangroves are these trees that have the large prop roots that come down and connect to the ground to support the tree. We'll be talking more on mangroves a little bit later on. These burls on the trunks of the tree are caused by an insect that invades the bark of the host tree and will ultimately, in really heavy infestations, kill them, as has happened here. There's a nice example of how the castorina needles carpet the ground. The duff gets several inches thick, and nothing else of any value for wildlife food plants or for beautiful native plants can penetrate through it. As you're walking this next section, be careful of these coconuts. When you're in an area like this where coconuts grow, be aware that coconuts fall. Okay, over to your left, you'll see a pipe that's sticking up out of the ground. That's a well casing that goes down 585 feet into a layer of water that's called the Lower Hawthorne Aquifer. And here on the Island Water Association drives in wells to that strata of water, or maybe even 200 feet more. They then pump it through a subterranean pipeline to the reverse osmosis plant up on Sanibel Captiva Road. And there the water is electronically charged and forced through specialized membranes, and all of the solids are then taken out. Solids including, of course, the chlorides, the salts. When this well was put in, it came in at 3,000 parts per million chlorides. Seawater in the Gulf is 35,000 parts. So this water would have a very distinctive salty flavor. It also has the odor and the taste of rotten eggs because of the sulfurous dioxide gas that's down inside the earth. This is an artesian well. The head pressure when this was put in was 20 feet. That means there was a 20-foot jet of water coming out of the ground before it was capped. This particular well was put in by the Coast Guard back in 1962. Incidentally, this land we're on is still owned in fee title by the U.S. Coast Guard. Had the technology been available to the Coast Guard back in '62 at an economical way to desalinize this water, all of this land at the Lighthouse Point would have been gobbled up and turned into a Coast Guard reservation. We would now not have the liberty to walk through it and enjoy it. But because the Coast Guard didn't have the technology to do it economically, they changed their mind and eventually built their big Coast Guard facility over at Fort Myers Beach and not on Sanibel. So that well is responsible for saving this point. Okay, this tree or plant, piece of which I have in my hand, is growing here, this shrub, is a Brazilian pepper. It was brought here back about the same time as the casarana. It was imported from Brazil as an ornamental plant. It was grown primarily around homesteads to sort of decorate the place. It has a very attractive bright red fruit that it produces in November and December, just about Christmas time, and local folks will take it and make very beautiful and attractive Christmas wreaths at Christmas time. It has that side of its character as being attractive, which I'll admit that the fruit is attractive, but it also has the bad habit of being a food source for migratory birds like robins that fly in here by the tens of thousands in the fall of the year, and the robins will gorge themselves on this little red berry. When they're new, they're much brighter. These are all dried, of course. And the robins will gorge themselves and digest the outer part. It's sort of like the raccoon that ate the strangler fig. These little seeds then pass through the robin's GI tract, and wherever robins fly in southern Florida, they're sowing Brazilian pepper seeds. And it's really much more of an environmental problem than the casarana because they grow so thickly and they become tremendous monotypic stands. And you see what happens, there is no sunlight penetration through the crown of this tree, and native plants, well, like that little cabbage palm there, I would imagine within a few years that will be outcompeted, that will die because of the lack of sunlight penetration. And here on the refuge, there's on Sanibel and also on the lands of the Conservation Foundation, there's tens of thousands of dollars, both public and private monies, being spent to control these plants. A couple of years ago in the local newspapers there was an AP story that told about some enterprising restaurateurs from the Northeast that were coming down to southern Florida, and they were picking these things and shipping them back north and selling them to the restaurant trade. People were using them and becoming violently ill. These things are extremely toxic. They're poisonous. Some people are highly allergic to them, so if you're in a swanky restaurant some night and you see red peppercorns, stay clear. It's probably these babies. They can cause all kinds of problems. That's the Brazilian pepper.
Very good. I had to remove every one from my property.
True,
Right.
true. But the city fails. They don't say that you must keep them off. That's where the shortcoming is.
Well, I had a fellow come out and inject the remaining root.
Mm-hmm. That'll take care of it.
We haven't had anything come back.
Until the robins come back again. Then you're in trouble.
That's a new cycle.
We were talking about water with that well over there. When I first moved to Sanibel, my family and I, consisting of my wife and my 2-month-old daughter, moved into that house, the second house, because back in those days this was the headquarters for the Ding-Darling National Wildlife Refuge, and we lived there until July of 1979. And back in those days, the early days, the only water that we had literally fell out of the heavens. It fell on the roofs. We had gutters and downspouts, and on top of this red brick structure was a 10,000-gallon cypress cistern. And then over between the houses was a 20,000-gallon metal tank. You can see part of the old footers over there where the tank rested. And then in front of that, between the houses, there were 2 tanks, or 2 towers, that went up almost as high as the main chimneys. And on each of those was a 2,000-gallon metal tank. At the base of one of the towers, we had a well point that went down in the ground. A well point is a perforated pipe through which you can suck water. And it went down about 5 or 6 feet into about that same type of water where the little footbridge was. It's just a brackish water, subsurface water. And we had gauges on the tanks. Whenever we needed water, I would turn on pumps that were located on the porch of quarters 1, this house, and I would pump water from the well point up to one tank and from the metal cistern to the other tank. Well, the brackish water from the high tank then fed the toilets of both houses. To flush the commode, you use the brackish water. The other tank fed the showers, the kitchen sink, the lavatory. But for drinking purposes, we drank the water from this tank because it was much easier to clean it just before the rainy season started. Or once the rainy season started. Once the daily rain started to come, we knew that this was a routine. We could go ahead and drain the cistern, clean it, and then regain our water very quickly. this was something usually done about the 4th of July. To get drinking water, we had a pipe that went through the wall of this house. This is the kitchen here, this wing. The houses were actually flip-flopped when they were built. They're flip-flopped 180 degrees. But my quarters had been remodeled, and the kitchen is located where that window is to the left of that stepladder. The original cistern had been located in that house, had been taken out many years before by a hurricane. So that was how we got our water until about 1965, I think it was, we connected to the Island Water Association. Okay, the houses and the lighthouse were commissioned in August of 1884. That means this August they'll be 103 years old. The lighthouse is a landfall light. It's not a light that warned people about rocks or reefs, anything like that offshore. The landfall light has a particular character of illumination, and the character of the Sanibel light still is 10 and 3. That means there would be a blink, 10 seconds of darkness, another blink, 3 seconds, blink, 10, blink, 3, blink, all through the night, so that a person that was navigating offshore, either in a steam vessel or a sailing vessel, if it was dark, he would see this light on the horizon, immediately go to his chart, time the character, say, well, it's a 10 and 3, then he'd know he was off the Sanibel light, not off the Boca Grande light or some other smaller aid to navigation. The skipper would then pick up some range lights out here at the mouth of San Carlos Bay, this body of water over here, and then he would sail or steam up to Punta Rassa, where the toll plaza is, where the high-rises are. And there, if it was a produce vessel, it would load the citrus and the produce that was raised on Sanibel Captiva. Or it might have been a cattle ship that was brought in here under steam, and cattle that were transported from Kissimmee, Orlando, Arcadia, places in the middle part of the state, that were brought overland by cowboys. They were put in large stock facilities at Punta Rassa. They were loaded on the cattle boats, and then they were shipped down to the Caribbean, Cuba, and the other Caribbean islands. Well, in 1926, that storm that I mentioned, that put up a 14.5-foot tide, a 12.5-foot tide, came and took out all of the facilities over at Punta Rassa, and they were never rebuilt. At the same time, the farming, of course, went out. That storm was lapping on the main beams of these houses. The waves were lapping just above where the pilings are connected to those main beams. The most recent severe hurricane we've experienced here occurred back in September of 1960. That was Hurricane Donna. Donna sort of skirted the coast. We had wind gusts on Sanibel of over 150 miles an hour, and Donna put up a 9-foot tide. This ground we're standing on is only 6 feet above mean sea level, so there was 3 feet of water running over this point. The flood of record that occurred back in 1873, some 11 years before these houses were built, was recorded at Punta Rassa, and there was a 14-foot 7-inch tide. Had these houses been existing at that time, of course, they probably would have been knocked down by the storm surge. The engineers that designed these homes had a heck of a lot more in the ball than some of our more recent engineers. When Sanibel was beginning to bustle and grow, the county was allowing buildings to go in quite close to the beach, as I mentioned, but they were also permitting really substandard building codes because they were allowing buildings to be built down relatively close to the ground level on floating footers. But when the city adopted the comprehensive land use plan, they also adopted federal flood regulations. And if you want federal flood insurance, you must build now with your first habitable floor 12.5 feet above mean sea level. That's why all of these nice new homes are piling homes, based on the engineering, of 100, 150 years ago, that when the folks recognized what serious impacts hurricanes can do. Hurricanes come in certain levels of intensity. We have several classes of storms. For example, a 100-year storm, and 100-year storms don't happen every 100 years. You could have 10 in 1 year. It's just the computers have worked out these levels of intensity. But a 100-year storm would put up a 12-foot tide. So the 1926 storm was probably one of those 100-year storms. The worst storm we could ever experience is called a 500-year storm. And a 500-year storm could put up a 20-foot storm tide. It would be 14 feet of water over where we're standing. and these things can happen, not to paint a,
So you might want to buy a house.
yeah, well, I'll sell one, not to paint a serious or a bad picture, but you'll notice these little signs that say evacuation route, little blue signs.
They mean it.
They don't take into the fact that Sanibel, of course, has grown considerably since this evacuation plan was first developed, and in our evacuation route we must use the same roads as the many residents over there at Fort Myers Beach are using, and the Weather Bureau really isn't that accurate. I recall back in 1982, suddenly we had a small tropical storm. The Weather Service hadn't forecasted. It's now called the no-name storm.
It was July.
July of 82, I believe it was, and it put up about a 6-foot tide. And just that quick, they had to close the causeway. You couldn't get on or off the island. So just imagine that their forecasting mechanisms break down, and we get a serious storm, and then really all hell could break loose here. It's really, it could be a bad and sad situation. This land, I mentioned, is still owned by the U.S. Coast Guard, and when the Fish and Wildlife Service left here in '82, the city of Sanibel came into the picture, and they negotiated with the Coast Guard to allow them to administer the Lighthouse Point as part of their park and outdoor recreational facilities. When I lived in that house, during a summer squall, without any exaggeration, the water would run down the walls like a waterfall. They leaked so badly. The roof leaked so badly. I had no air conditioning in that house for the first 10 years, and finally I broke down and I bought a personal window unit. I had to drink rainwater. There was no insulation in the walls or the ceiling. So the first thing the city did, they said, okay, Coast Guard, we'll take over this for you, but you've got to give us some money up front. So the Coast Guard gave the city $60,000, and they put on brand new roofs, they put in central air and heat, they insulated it. Of course, they have city water now to drink, not rainwater. When I moved into that house, I paid $4.50 a pay period, $9 a month. And when I left there, the government had raised my rent to over $300 per month. That's the reason I left. And now the city employees that live here, the city manager's secretary and her husband live in this house. Someone from Public Works lives in that house, and they live there rent-free. All of their utilities, except their long-distance phone calls, are paid for.
So there's my tax dollars.
Why do they live there?
They bid on it, and they have to conduct certain maintenance tasks like picking up trash and doing painting and repair on the buildings.
Is the lighthouse still being used?
Yes, the lighthouse is still used. If you come across the bridge and you'll notice it, it's still in character. The Coast Guard tried to extinguish it maybe 10 years ago, but local people raised so much cane they decided to keep it functional. However, it's not. It really can't be used as an aid to navigation. You can be offshore 5 miles, and there is so much illumination from development at Fort Myers Beach and also at the western end of Sanibel, you can't find it. But it's still operable. It's really a funny thing the way the bureaucracy works too. If you came across the bridge and you were interested in lighthouses and you saw the lighthouse was out, we'll say, you went to your telephone book and you found U.S. Coast Guard, knowing that the Coast Guard is responsible for these things. You called up the Coast Guard, well, the folks over at Fort Myers Beach would answer, and you'd say, I'd like to report the Sanibel Lighthouse is out. They say, well, thank you very much. We appreciate you telling us. They would then get on the telephone, and they would telephone St. Petersburg, 95 miles away, and say, hey, guys, the Sanibel Lighthouse is out again. The next morning, they dispatch a couple of young Coast Guardsmen with maybe a couple of 250-watt light bulbs. That's what runs the thing now. Maybe some standby batteries. And they would get the thing operating again. That's because, you see, the Coast Guard station at Fort Myers Beach is search, rescue, anti-drug. It has nothing to do with aids to navigation. They're up in St. Petersburg.
Everybody's a specialist.
True.
What do you mean by floating footings?
Well, just footers with rebar. They're called floating footers. It's one of the terms that are used. They just, a monolithic pour is a floating footer, where it's just on the ground surface. It has no anchorage. And most of these new condos that are being built, the houses don't go down so far, but most of the condos go down to bedrock, which may be 17 to 30 feet deep. They're until the impact is such they've struck bedrock. And I was always told that these pilings went down to bedrock too, but at the time the transfer between the service and the city was going on, the Coast Guard brought the original construction drawings over, and these only go down about 7. It talks about the loggerhead sea turtle. When I first came to Sanibel, I began to monitor the nesting population of loggerhead turtles that use these beaches for nesting purposes. And we formed an organization called Coretta Research. Coretta Research means loggerhead turtle research because the turtle's scientific name is Coretta coretta. We're all wearing the official Coretta Research t-shirts this afternoon, as you notice, with the Coretta Research patch. The loggerhead turtle is classified as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act. It's protected by the federal, state, and some local governments. And right now, the loggerheads that are going to reproduce this year, the females, have been basically by this late in this month, have been fertilized, and within the next few weeks they'll begin to come closer. And about the first week in May, they begin to come ashore. They crawl across the dry beach. This is after dark, usually about 10, 11 o'clock at night. They reach the pioneer vegetation line where the sea oats and the various grasses start on the beach face. And there they dig an egg chamber in the ground that may be 8 inches in diameter and 23 inches deep. They then lay a clutch of eggs that numbers between 40 and 190. An average clutch is 137. They then would normally cover up the eggs, turn around, and go back into the Gulf of Mexico. On Sanibel, we patrol by jeep. On Captiva, we use 3-wheel motorcycles or go by foot. And we look for the track the turtle makes as she has left the water, like in the middle of the illustration. It looks just like a little bulldozer has hauled out and walked across the beach. The track may be 4 feet wide in some large turtles. When we find a track, we know we have an animal on the beach, especially if it's a single track, we know that she's still up there. So someone gets out and walks up to see what she's doing. If she's just beginning to dig an egg chamber, we have to wait because at that point they're very easily frightened off. But if they're laying eggs, then it's very mechanical and they're sort of oblivious to what's going on around them, so we can get out and we go ahead and we measure the turtle. And the first thing we do is we look for a tag. I have one on my keychain. This is a Monell metal tag that has a number that identifies the turtle specifically, and then on the back is a little message that says reward for return, Coretta Research, Sanibel, Florida, USA. So the turtle is permanently identified by this tag. This is put on the front flipper. We then record the measurements. The longest turtle we ever measured on Sanibel was 46.5 inches long, and back in those days we weighed them with a portable weighing apparatus, and that turtle weighed 345 pounds. Very good-sized animal. The turtle is then allowed to go back into the Gulf of Mexico. The tagging program has told us some very interesting things about these turtles. We know now that the Sanibel Captiva turtles nest on 2-year cycles. In other words, the females that are going to nest this year, if they nested before, they nested in 85, 83, so on, then the other part of the population would nest next year and in subsequent even years. We found that each year they nest, they multiple nest on the average of 3 times. In other words, a turtle will come on the beach, let's say the 10th of May, she'll nest, she'll go back in the water. 13 nights later, she's back up on the beach again, lays another clutch, goes back in the water. 13 nights later, she's back up on the beach nesting. These are not all in the same spot. It could be, spread out over several miles of beachfront. We had one turtle that we found in 1973 that nested 6 times. We found her nesting those 6 times. And in those 6 nestings, she laid 920 eggs. And she is the only turtle we ever named. Does everyone know what we named her?
Fertile turtle.
Myrtle the fertile turtle. Well, I think that Myrtle probably burned herself out that year because we haven't seen her since. The tags come back from a wide area, and I'll sort of draw you some parameters of where these Sanibel turtles go. We've had the tags come back from loggerheads that were drowned in shrimp nets off the coast of the Chandelier Islands off of Louisiana. From the south side of the Yucatan Peninsula, they were caught by Mexican gill fishermen. From the northeastern coast of Cuba, from Little Abaco in the Bahamas, turtles were caught by Bahamian turtle fishermen that use spears to harvest them because it's still legal in the Bahamas. From offshore of Atlantic City, New Jersey, one of our turtles was caught in a pound net fishing device, and one of our turtles was caught on by a hook and line fisherman up in Virginia in Chesapeake Bay. So these turtles do move tremendous distances. Okay, I failed to mention that when the eggs are laid by the turtle, let's say there's a clutch of turtle eggs located right here, we have to make a decision whether we should let the eggs stay there or whether we should relocate them. If the turtle nested too close to the water and we're fearful that a wave overwash may cut them out, we'll move them further up on the beach. If the clutch is too close to a bright light, like one of these mercury vapor lights or a condo light or bright house lights, we also move them. Because what happens, the incubation period takes about 55 days, and the young turtles break through the eggshell. They do this basically at all the same time. And they begin to tunnel upward in that chamber, and as they do this, they knock away the ceiling, and that sand then filters down through the squirming turtles. It becomes the floor, and it's like a natural elevator moving the turtles towards the surface. This part of the trip takes about 3 days. Well, they get to the surface, and the sand is so hot they can't break through because they die from sunlight radiation, so they wait until things cool down. And let's say we know there's a clutch of 150 turtle eggs there. Well, about 82% hatch. So let's say there's 130 turtles down inside the ground. It's now cooling off, and we're standing around watching it. We do this often. You never get tired of it because it never ceases to amaze me. And you look away, and all of a sudden you look back, and here's a little turtle head, just a little bit smaller than these guys on the T-shirt. And then all of a sudden there's a flipper, and whammo, it's like a little volcano. There's 130 turtles at the top of the sand, all looking around. And what they do, they orient themselves to the brightest source of light. And on a dark beach, the brightest source of light is the seaward horizon, not the vegetated horizon. So no problem, they go right for the Gulf of Mexico. But if it's a nest that we missed and it's too close to a bright light, when they come out of the sand, that artificial light overpowers the natural sea-finding ability, and they go the wrong way. They head inland. And they may have to cross roads or parking lots, and they get squashed by cars. Or they may get trapped in beach vegetation, can't make it to the water, and the next morning the raccoons or the fish crows find them. We don't know what the survival rate is. We know about 82% of the eggs hatch, but we don't know what the survival rate is from the time they reach the water because it takes 20 or 30 years for them to mature. And it's estimated that only about 1/4% will make it back as adults to reproduce. Any questions on the turtles?
How endangered are they?
Well, there's different levels of endangerment. The Endangered Species Act has endangered and threatened. The green turtle is in Florida is endangered. They're very close to being gone. In the loggerhead turtle, it's estimated there's about 30,000 adult females left in the western Atlantic. So it's still a high number, but the loss is really tremendous. One of the greatest losses is in the commercial fishing industry. The shrimp boats accidentally drown them offshore, and they tow them and they drown them, and the carcasses wash in. This year on Sanibel, from January 1st until just last week, there were 30 dead turtles that floated in. Nationwide last year, there were 1,700 and some, a few over that washed in and were recorded by the Sea Turtle Stranding Network. It's estimated that there were 12,000 turtles of all species drowned in the western Atlantic last year by shrimp boats.
What is their natural enemy? What is their worst natural enemy?
Worst natural enemy at sea would be sharks. About 40% of the turtles we find have been mutilated by sharks somewhat. They have flippers missing or tips or whole flippers, chunks out of the shell, and then disease. In some species there's a new disease that's springing up. It's a papilloma. It's a cancer-like growth on the skin that it's just a ghastly thing to see. I found green turtles dead on the beach here, subadults about 2 feet long, with these growths the size of my fist on each eye, and they couldn't see it, they couldn't feed. It's really and no one knows what's causing it. Of course, no one knows what the cure will be.
about the eggs? Are they in danger from raccoons or anything like that?
They are. The last year we had a serious problem with raccoons and turtle eggs in Sanibel was back in the late 60s. You see, with the increase in the human population, there are more garbage cans and more dumpsters, so the raccoons are feeding off of garbage, and they're not going out on the beaches to eat the eggs. I haven't seen a raccoon on the Sanibel beach in a couple of years. But years ago, 40% of all the eggs laid here were eaten by raccoons. Some areas south of us, south of Naples, 99% of them are eaten by raccoons. It's really a tremendous drain. Okay, of course, you all came to Sanibel this time to find pretty shells, right? Did everyone find some?
Sure did.
Good. You know, Sanibel is supposed to be the third best shelling place in the world. I think the best place is supposed to be the Great Barrier Reef. And Sanibel is still a very good place to find shells, but you'll hear a lot of pros and cons as you're out on the beach and you see little things in the local newspapers about how bad the shelling is. I tend to believe that shelling is only bad today because of the lack of the type of weather events that it takes to get shelling to be as good as it can be. And what it takes strong winds blowing out of the northwest, coming across the Gulf, and very heavy cold fronts with 30, 35 knot winds, temperatures dropping down very low. And as the waves break across the surface of the beach, that energy is generated down to the bottom and things begin to break loose. And if the wind blows long enough, the shells and other organisms get up on the beach. And if the weather is bad enough, shelling can still be very good. It's sort of like taking a garden rake and reaching over here and pulling all of this stuff over to my foot. If I do it long enough, then I'll get everything over here to my foot. It's the same principle offshore. Most people that get into serious shelling, after they pick up a few pretty shells, they begin to look for specific varieties. And two that are sought after by most folks that come here are right in the middle of that exhibit. The Junonia on the right, the white shell with the brown spots, and then to the left of it is the lion's paw. The Junonia is a typical univalve, like a snail. It has one opening. The lion's paw is a bivalve, like a clam or an oyster. And every week in the local newspapers, the Islander or the Island Reporter, I'm always amazed that someone is standing there in a photograph holding a beautiful Junonia, sometimes 4 and 5 photographs per week. I've been shelling this beach, and still do when the shelling is good, for close to 30 years. I found 5 Junonias. None of them were as good as that one in that case. And I personally know people who at Christmas and Easter go to the shell shops and they buy several dozen of the Junonias. You can buy them $3, $5 each. And they actually seed the beach in front of their houses so the grandkids can find Junonias. And I'm not saying that's going on, but I'd be willing to bet there's something very fuzzy about this whole Junonia situation. I mentioned the shrimp boats, you know, catching turtles offshore. This happens quite often, and the shrimping industry is declining somewhat because the shrimp resource is dwindling. The number of shrimp available for catch is declining, and many of the crew members that work the shrimp boats are actually making more money off of live shells than they are off of shrimp. And most of the Junonias, lion's paws, and the big spiny oysters you see in the shell shops are all caught offshore in those shrimp nets. Any questions on?
How old would a shell like this be?
It's really hard to say. In some species, you can actually judge them based on a seasonal ring that progresses along the lip, similar to the rings of a tree. I'd say that Junonia probably is 3, 4 years old, but that's just a guess, without actually raising one in captivity. They grow very fast compared to other types of life. And that's one of the big controversies. You'll hear people say, well, shelling is not as good as it used to be because everybody's out there getting shells, and the city is passing resolutions asking you to take no more than 2 live specimens per species per day. Well, that's good. It's a good conservation technique, but it has no bearing on any scientific evidence because the reproductivity of seashells will just boggle your mind. Just a common oyster will produce billions of spat. And if the habitat is there, then these animals are going to occupy the habitat. So the shell resource is probably every bit as abundant as it was 100 years ago, with the exception of limited areas where there may be some over-collecting. It's my opinion that the threat to seashells is not over-collecting. The threat to seashells locally is ultimately pollution. Pollutants coming down the Caloosahatchee River and damaging the water resource that we have. I mentioned cold weather and bad storms. The coldest I ever saw it here was December 13th, 1962. I woke up one morning, it was 18 degrees, the water was frozen between the cistern and the spigot in the house. I couldn't make coffee, so I went back to bed that morning.
Cold.
Man.
On Sanibel Captiva, we have two different types of beaches. We have high-energy beaches and low-energy beaches. I'll draw another map on the ground. This is Captiva, and then, of course, the crescent of Sanibel. And then over here is Fort Myers Beach, the mainland. When a storm swell or a sea breeze occurs, it usually comes out of the west. And as the wind blows out of the west, these sea swells get rather large and crash against the barrier islands. And as they do, they curl, of course, and they cut away the soil. The soil, the sand, and the shell are transported offshore by a slight undertow current. It's not a dangerous undertow for swimmers, but nonetheless it's there. It's a natural section of a natural system. Along the Gulf Coast, we have a current that moves from north to south called the littoral current. And the littoral current, its main reason for being there, is to restabilize and re-nourish beaches. Sand that is transported or carried away from other islands further north is carried by the littoral current. It falls out of suspension and it slowly keeps building up the beaches and maintains the beaches as they would normally be. So the waves crash on Captiva, are removed, sand is transported down the coast. It ends up some on Captiva, some on western Sanibel. So that's a high-energy beach system. As these swells come out of the Gulf, because of the curvature of Sanibel, the swells miss us. You very seldom see a swell here at the eastern end because there is no origin for the swells. They're coming out of the west, they bypass us. So this end of Sanibel is called a low-energy beach. The only time you'll see a swell here is a temporary thing, when a squall kicks up suddenly and drives up some pretty good-sized waves, or of course a tropical depression would heap up the swells. We have several passes here. On the east coast, they're called inlets. On the Gulf Coast, they're called passes. San Carlos Bay here is basically a pass. A pass is where water can interchange with the ebb and flow of the tide. Then we have Blind Pass that separates Sanibel from Captiva, where the little bridge is. Then further north, we have Captiva Pass. Then we have Upper Captiva, or North Captiva it's being called today. And then another pass, and then Captiva. Well, this other pass wasn't there until 1923. A storm came along. It washed through what is now called Redfish Pass. And Redfish, well, South Seas Plantation is located right there at Redfish, to orient you. Redfish washed through so rapidly that it cut extremely deep and it's relatively wide. And much of the water that would be going off these other passes is finding it much easier to discharge on ebb tide through Redfish Pass. It's like a Venturi effect. On an ebb tide, ebbing spring tide, water runs through Redfish at 10 knots. That's about 13 miles an hour. And what it's doing, it's pushing the littoral current further west. So sand that is supposed to get on Captiva simply isn't getting there. It's bypassing, and it's ending up on western Sanibel, and the other barrier islands further south. To illustrate to you the extent of that change up there, with the pass, you see with the littoral current is bringing it down, but it's not getting on Captiva. So the result is that Captiva is eroding very, very rapidly. And just to document how rapidly this has happened, you've all been up on Captiva and you've driven along the road where Tween Waters is, and the rocks are on the left-hand side. They're trying to save the road. Well, you make that 90-degree turn, the paved road. Well, in 1903, the late postmistress of the Sanibel post office, who was here when I came. She was born in a house in a grapefruit grove 2,000 feet off that 90-degree turn. And at that site, even today, when the water's calm enough, and if you can get a fishing guide that knows about it, one of the old-time guides up there, he can take you out there to a spot where one of these flowing wells is still flowing. The head of pressure comes to the surface and it actually bubbles at the surface. So in the past 84 years, 2,000 feet of Captiva has disappeared, and it's still going, and it's going fairly fast. In 1982, South Seas Plantation and the property owners up there got together, and they pumped in with a hydraulic dredge a new beach 10,000 feet long and 65 feet wide. It cost $3.6 million. The engineers give it a life of something like 10 years. So some years down the road, it's like money down a rat hole. They'll have to do the same thing again. It'll cost $10 million or more. And now the people south of South Seas, between there and the pass, are in a political haggle about who's going to pay for a new beach there. But they had better get their act together because they're really in trouble. Okay, the extreme, the other extreme from erosion is accretion. When I came here, the road to the lighthouse came in where the sea grape is, in behind this casuarina, and this ridge between us and the garbage cans was the foredune. And all of this vegetation you see out here, all of the sea oats and the little trees out there, that was all the Gulf of Mexico. The water actually went underneath the house at high tide. And at high tide, I could take a cast net on the back porch, I could throw it off and catch mullet. In the summertime, I could take a rod and reel with a mirror lure and catch 20, 25-pound snook off the back porch of that house. At high tide, spring high tide, we had to take a plank and walk to the stairs to keep from getting our shoes wet. So all of this has accreted in since 1958.
Is this Captiva?
This is part of Captiva. Was that,
Ridge has grown.
that the question you're asking me?
Yes.
Yeah, all of this sand is probably from Captiva. True. Was that your question?
Yes.
Hmm? Yeah, your area is growing. When I came here, the pass was down just about where the little footbridge is at Blind Pass Condos, and it closed up in 1963. From 63 until 67, I could drive a Jeep from the lighthouse at low tide all the way around to Captiva. Then the pass opened back up where it is now in 1972. Then it closed up a year later. Now it's open again. But that part of the beach has very much expanded since in the past 10 years.
Well, from the 1908 charts, that's grown 550 feet.
Mm-hmm. I can easily see where it has.
Why don't they dam up that root test?
Well, that was a consideration. One of the problems is, I think, not only would it cost countless millions of dollars to do it, it would be an engineering feat of tremendous proportions. If it was a navigable waterway that was maintained by the Corps of Engineers, they might have some impact to do things to make some changes. But it's not maintained by the Corps of Engineers, so there's no money to do it. It could never be done. So it's just a proposition where if you live on a barrier island, you have to accept that this is a thing that could happen. And all this 500 feet of beach that is built in since 1908, I mean, it's conceivable that a storm out of the right direction could take half that away in 12 hours. I mentioned the coastal construction setback line. There's a little white monument out there on the beach. There's also one back here in the sea grapes. It's hard to see now, but that's the line. It's an arbitrary line that the state of Florida prepared to identify areas where storm surge would reach during certain intensities of hurricanes. So to build anything now in Sanibel, you have to build behind that construction setback line. Therefore, these exhibits and the buildings and the lighthouse couldn't be built. Because it's rather warm this afternoon, I know how we don't need to get out there and burn our skin up, I'll talk about a few things that I normally talk about out on the beach here under the shade trees. That is one thing that I like about casuarinas. They do provide shade in situations like this. And it's also sort of nice to hear the wind blowing through the casuarina needles. It gives it that ambience of an island atmosphere. Other than that, I hate casuarinas. Okay, just a couple of notes on tides. We normally have 2 highs and 2 lows here a day, and the tides run about 5 hours and 55 minutes apart. The tides, as we all know, are primarily the responsibility of the alignment of the sun and the moon and the earth. As the moon moves around the earth, the gravitational force of the moon creates a theoretical tidal bulge that moves around between the earth and the moon. And then you get the highs and the lows of tide. If you look at the tide charts, either those that are at the marinas or in the local newspapers, the tides that are published are taken here at Point Bell, at the Lighthouse Point. If you're going back into the wildlife refuge to go bird watching, you want to go there as close to low tide as possible, because the lower the tide, the shallower the water, the more mud flats are exposed, and therefore the more colonial birds, the ibis and egrets and herons, are out there. They're feeding. However, the tide at the refuge, as you drive out the wildlife drive and you hit the mangroves on both sides, and there's some water control structures that go under the road, at that first culvert, the lag time in the tide is about 2 hours. So if the published tide, we'll say, is 10 o'clock in the morning, that's here. Out there, did I say 10 o'clock in the morning?
Yes.
Out there it would be noon. So bear that in mind. And of course, the further you go out the drive, the earlier the tide is. The lag time is lessened because it's a matter of waters having to meander through creeks and bays and sounds to get to these various points. And the more open the water is, the easier the tide has to get to those certain points at an earlier time period. If you look at the tides, you'll notice that it'll run 2 highs, 2 lows, 2 highs, 2 lows for most of the month. Then all of a sudden there's only 1 high and 1 low, and that really boggles people's minds, because most people that live on seacoasts, you know, they know their tides are routine. You know, they're either diurnal or semi-diurnal, and it's like clockwork when they change. But here in the Gulf of Mexico, once a month, when the moon and the sun are both pulling on the waters of the earth, and because of the configuration of the Gulf of Mexico with the Florida Peninsula and the Yucatan Peninsula, it's like a gigantic basin. And the sun helps overreact the gravitational force of the moon and causes an extended lag time. So you have only 1 high and 1 low. It's very, very unusual. Our highs here and lows are about 1.8 between high and low. It's a very, very minimal tide. That would be subject to weather. Strong northwest winds, for example, would make a more negative tide.
What would be the lag time to Bowman's Beach from here?
Well, on the outside, at the pass, it's about 15 minutes earlier than here.
Okay.
And because the pass has closed up, I personally haven't timed it to see what it is, you know, just inside, say at the south end of Roosevelt Channel. When the pass was closed, it was some hours difference, but now there's a lot of water running in through Blind Pass, so I don't really know what it would be there.
Those lags are due to the hydrological, not geographic distance.
Right. Right. All of our tides are based on tides at St. Petersburg, and then it's all projected down north and south of St. Petersburg. Fort Myers, way up the river, you know, 20 miles away, the lag time there is like 5 hours, because the water it takes that long for that water to reach those tidal crests or lows. The beach is pretty well cleaned of most organisms right now. There are a few things that we can talk about. We happen to get a glimpse at this creature. This is quite an unattractive animal. It's a soft-bodied thing. It's a sea hare. It is a mollusk. It has a small shell. It's related to the octopus and the squid. And when it's in the water, it flies with these wings extend, and it's a very, very beautiful, slow flying creature.
Now, is that one dying or dead, or?
It's about dead. It's pretty well beat up. There are some shells embedded in it. I'll toss it out and see what happens. See if it'll fly. Yeah. Closer? Yeah. You can go ahead and touch it. It's just very soft.
It really feels like, I don't know.
It's a little mucus on it. It's cool.
his wings are
Once you touch
moving.
your clothes, your toes turn black.
Yes, I didn't see this black spot. That's how it starts. Okay, I'm going to turn it loose in here and see what it does. You see, when things get up in the surf line like this, the turbulence tends to drive them against the bottom, and they get fairly stressed. It's trying to open its wings. He's trying. I think that's the tide flow that's really moving it. There it goes. Yeah, very, very graceful. Well, we'll see. This material here, you'll find it very commonly on the beach. This is not a real nice specimen. This is a colonial tunicate. It's an encrusting tunicate. It's a group of small animals that, if this was a nice one, you could hold it up and actually see the cells that distinguish them. And they live on the bottom. They have little polyp arms similar to the little arms that barnacles have, and they reach out and they grab little floating planktonic animals, and they filter those ingredients out, and that's their means of nourishment. That's a tunicate. You'll see great clumps of it. Some are pink, some are bluish colored, and they're commonly called sea beef or sea pork. You see that guy here. And these are usually very common on the beach. This is the case that is produced by a worm called a parchment worm. It's a very near parchment-like material. And they live in the bottom of the mud or the sand, buried down about so far, with both of these tips sticking up. The worm is very unattractive, sort of a yellowish soft worm. And as they live, they pulsate their body, and they have a series of pistons inside here, and they pump these pistons, they pull in water. Water then filters through their feeding organs, and then the waste product is ejected out through the other end. And at times, shelling is good. These things are just thick as can be. That's the parchment worm. He's probably being carried along by the tide. You see these folks out here? They're out there shelling. This time of year, we have a major problem. They're probably unaware of it, but in April and May, the stingrays, little rays about so broad, are reproducing, and quite often they come in great numbers along the shoreline. And the stingray at the base of the tail has a serrated spine that is encased in a mucus sheath. And if you step directly on the stingray, it will try to get away and jab you with this spine. And that causes a serious puncture wound. It's subject to serious infection. And many people this time of year are injured by stingrays. So what I recommend is that when you're in the water shelling or swimming, well, not swimming, but if you're shelling, try to remember to wear footwear. But if you don't, and even if you do, you want to do the Sanibel shuffle. You don't walk on the beach like you're walking across a busy road, stomping your feet, because if you step on a stingray, you're liable to get it. So what you do, and it's a fairly easy practice once you learn it, you just sort of shuffle your feet. You can make good speed, keep your toes down along the bottom, and in doing this, if there is a ray buried down there with his eyes out looking for a crab to pass by, your toes will go beneath him, he'll lift up and shuttle away and cause no problem. But they can be very dangerous. I'm surprised we haven't seen any this afternoon. Yeah, I'm surprised we haven't seen any this afternoon.
We were down here about a month ago, and the whole school's up 10, 15, 20.
Earlier about the mangrove trees, and I told you we had the white, the black, and the red mangroves. And I told you that the buttonwood tree is called a mangrove by some people, and I told you it's really not. And the reason the buttonwood is not a mangrove is because, like most trees, the buttonwood produces seeds. In the mangroves, and there are 55 different species around the earth, they produce live young. And what happens, the mangrove will blossom, the blossom is pollinated, the petals fall away, and from that site a small node grows about 2 inches long, and from that node grows one of these cigar-shaped devices. This is called a red mangrove propagule. And as it grows heavier at the end, it matures, it pulls away, it falls in the water. It usually floats horizontal for a few days until this end takes in water, and then it begins to settle down, and it floats with just the tip up above the water level, and it bobs along. If it's back in the mangrove tidal area where it belongs, and if it's lucky, a wave may stick this heavy end in the mud, and if the next few waves don't break it loose, this tip turns into leaves, sunlight attraction pulls it erect, and you have the start of a mangrove forest. If you can find some of these, you may find some mature ones on the bay side around the causeway. Would be a good spot to look. Look for one or several that are tight, that are nice and green, and the tip is pointed and is beautiful leaf green. Take a few home, wrap them in plastic, take them back to your residence, put them in a pot of potting soil, bury them, the heavy end down about 1/3 of the way, put it in a sunny spot, a sunroom in the winter, out on the porch in the summertime. You'll have a great souvenir of Sanibel. You'll have your own red mangrove tree. It does work. I have a cousin in Massachusetts that I sent one to 8 years ago. I was up there 2 years ago this month and saw it in her living room. It's every bit as pretty as one of these banyan trees, and it's sending down prop roots now. It's very nice. I don't know what she'll do with it when it grows up, but move, send it home.
That's good.
Back last June 15th during our regular nighttime turtle patrol, we had tagged an adult loggerhead down by the Gulfside City Park about 1 o'clock in the morning. We continued our run east, and we usually pull off the beach here at the Lighthouse Point, and right here in this spot was a 250-pound loggerhead turtle laying its eggs. And she laid her eggs. We went about the business of tagging her, and then to mark the nest, because we monitor the nest some 60 days after the eggs were laid, we put this little stake in the ground with the reflectorized tape. Well, normally we do this out in the open beach face where they're very easily found, but what happened in this case, the grass grew up around it. We lost track of it. We couldn't find it last summer. I didn't find this until maybe 2 months ago, one Saturday morning. So the eggs were never examined. We don't know how productive this nest was. The remains of the eggs are probably down in this location. In the summertime, we take folks out on the turtle patrol, and everybody that comes to Sanibel thinks, they get this vision of how nice and quiet and calm and peaceful Sanibel is and how non-typical it is. So we usually start off our discussion on sea turtles with, if these folks are new, have never been on turtle patrol before, that we say, tonight you may get to see a nesting turtle. You may get to handle a fresh loggerhead turtle egg and feel it in the palm of your hand. But one thing we'll guarantee you tonight, you're going to see Sanibel's red light district. Everybody says, what's going on here? And by August, at Bowman's Beach, well, in front of your home even, these reflectorized stakes, there may be up to 100 of them, and as you drive down the beach, you see red light, red light, red light, red light. It's really impressive, the number of nests that we monitor in that way.
That's great.
Well, with that, I'll end the beach walk. When we're through, if you have any questions that I can help you with or other things we can discuss, I'll try to respond to them. I've enjoyed talking with you this afternoon. Once my voice got going, I had to take an allergy pill before I left, but now everything is going fine. And I've enjoyed talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Great.
Cut.
Because you want to go check, see what you got on your place that's...
That's right.
Now half the stuff you
I
know
know
what
about
it was,
this.
you can go out and label.
Yeah, I try to be subtle about that so some kid won't pull it up on me.
Before everybody disperses,
Oh, listen.
let's decide
One
who,
second
do we
here.
have time
Sure.
to do what?
What company? What kind of company do your
He
husband
has
have?
his own company. He has several companies.